Good afternoon and good morning if you're in China, and good evening if you're on the East Coast. I'm Man Wang, Director at the Washington State China Relations Council. Welcome to today's panel discussion on the current and the post-COVID business environment in China. This program is co-sponsored by the Washington State China Relations Council, the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, and Committee of 100. I'd like to thank all of our partners for helping to make this happen. We know that China's business climate has changed dramatically in recent years. Economic, trade, and geopolitical tensions between the US and China have created many uncertainties for US companies doing business in and with China. On top of that, COVID-19 and Chinese government's zero COVID policy have put many businesses in an unprecedentedly challenging situation. We've heard stories from both sides. Those who enjoy robust business and look forward to expand their operations in China, and those who didn't fare well and decided to leave the China market. But one common challenge we often hear of is the risk of Chinese government intervention in foreign enterprise operations. So what's the real story now in China? And what strategies should companies develop to be successful and to mitigate many of the challenges? Today, we're delighted to have a group of experienced China-based business leaders and seasoned China watchers to discuss this important topic and to share their insights. Our panelists include Eric Zheng, President of AmCham Shanghai and Greater China Chair of Committee of 100, Dr. Robert Kapp, President of Robert A. Kapp Associates. Bob is also a board director of the WSCRC and former president of the US-China Business Council, and Daniel Brindle, CEO of Novartis China and governor of AmCham Shanghai. Norwell Coquillard, the executive director at the Washington State China Relations Council, will serve as the moderator. Now let me briefly introduce our moderator, Norwell. Norwell will then introduce the panelists. Norwell spent over 30 years in Asia, serving as business executive, mainly at Cargill. 18 of those years were spent in Shanghai. During that time, he also held numerous positions in business associations, including serving as the chairman of AmCham Shanghai from 2008 to 2009. For today's program, we'll start with a moderated discussion session and then turn to audience for questions. If you have questions for the panelists, please type them in the chat box. We'll try to address them all during the audience Q&A session. Nor, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mon, and welcome everyone to today's session. I think most of you are familiar, hopefully you saw when you signed up with the bios of our speakers, but I'll briefly run through those and then we'll get started on our main topic for today. So first, let me introduce Bob Kapp. He's known to most of us in the business community for his time as president of the US-China Business Council. Bob was in this role from 1994 to 2004, and of course that was during the period when China joined the WTO. Before moving to Washington, D.C., which he did in the mid-90s, Bob was the president of the Seattle-based Washington Council on International Trade, and he was also the founding executive director of my organization, the Washington State China Relations Council. In his previous life, Bob was in academia at Rice University and at the University of Washington. Dr. Kapp served for many years as a senior advisor to the China program of the Carter Center and currently serves as a special advisor to the US-China Education Trust. He's a member on the Council of Foreign Relations, the National Committee of US-China Relations, and of course, the Washington State China Relations Council. Bob's received a number of awards and honors over the years, both for his teaching and for his efforts on behalf of stable and productive US-China relations. Bob is a graduate of Swarthmore College and he received his doctorate in modern Chinese history from Yale. Our second panelist is Eric Zheng. I think does not need any real introduction, but as we all know, Eric became the president of AmCham China in 2022, just in this year. He started his career in management consulting with PwC in the US and later served as the US Department of Commerce as the principal commercial officer in the US consulate in Guangzhou. Eric then embarked on a long career with AIG in Greater China and held a series of positions, culminating in his service as the CEO of AIG China. Following that, he chaired the board of Hong An Standard Life Insurance Company. Eric also serves as the Greater China Regional Chair of the Committee of 100, and the Shanghai government has granted Eric its Magnolia Gold Award for recognition of his significant contributions to the city. Eric's bachelor's degree is from Fudan, and he has an MBA from Georgetown. And our third panelist today is Dan Brindle. Dan is the president of Novartis Group China. Mr. Brindle joined Novartis from the China law firm ZY Partners, where he was a partner focused on China corporate law and external strategic engagement. Prior to this role, he was vice president, international government affairs for GlaxoSmithKline in Singapore. Mr. Brindle has also held senior leadership roles with Pfizer and Eli Lilly across Asia and in the United States. Dan has his law degree from Lewis and Clark, and he's a member of the State Bar of California. He earned his bachelor's degree locally here at the University of Puget Sound and conducted graduate coursework at Cornell and at the Hopkins Nanjing Center for Chinese and American Studies. As mentioned, Dan is now based in Shanghai with his family. So without further ado, it's time to get into questions for our panelists. And as Mon said, we'll do moderated Q&A for a while, and then we'll move to audience questions. And again, put your questions in the chat box, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. So we want to talk about post-COVID business environment in China. But before we do, I'd like to just hear what the business environment is like today. Eric, I know that AmCham does a survey every year of its members. So how would you describe the status of U.S. companies in business today? What's the situation like on the ground?
Sure, Nor. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with old friends like you and Bob, and also my colleague from Shanghai, Dan. When you look at its business environment in China, we often refer to our annual survey, what we call China Business Review, CBR. And if you look at the latest, which was last year, 2021, actually, there was an interesting data point, what we call the 5-year outlook for our members. Historically, the percentage of our members who feel optimistic or relatively optimistic, it was around 80% until certainly 2019 and 2020 during the US-China trade wars. That number dropped down to around 60%. So it's almost like a 20 percentage point drop. Until last year, 2021, there was a significant rebound, not quite to 80%, but 78%, very close to our historical average. So you could reach some conclusions from that report from last year that our members felt quite good about the outlook for the next 5 years. And they continue to be very successful in terms of profitability, in terms of their view of China as one of the top 3 markets. And so until obviously late last year, things were going very well for our members. Now, obviously, this year is different. We are going to continue to go through this latest round of COVID with Omicron, and there have been lockdowns, partial lockdowns, and obviously the national policy is zero COVID. So this obviously has changed a lot, the local environment. So we are actually in the middle of doing the current CBR, our annual survey. We are collecting data. I'll be very curious to see the current numbers as far as the next 5-year outlook. My guess is that it's going to be several percentage drops, at least from 78 last year. We can talk about those driving factors in our conversation today. But I think most our companies' number one concern, I would say 2 concerns. The number one concern is long-term, is the U.S.-China relations, the tensions between these 2 countries, plus geopolitical tensions. And number 2 is more kind of short-term to medium-term, that's COVID. How are we going to deal with the current policies of zero COVID policy?
Thanks. Both of those issues you just raised, we've got questions we'll raise on those later, because both of those have come up as being very key issues. Can we break it down a little bit by sectors? Again, we've heard about supply chain problems. We know there are foreign companies that have some issues, but can we talk a little bit maybe about sectors? Dan, do you want to talk about pharmaceuticals and your industry, and is it gotten better or worse over the last couple of years, and how do you see it going?
It's interesting, because I think depending on what business sector you are in, you could have a very different experience. My personal experience has always been in healthcare and in pharmaceuticals. As I answer this, I think you got to kind of have it in a bit of perspective, because I first came to China as a student in '87, did graduate work in the '90s there, started working there professionally in the late '90s. And have been there pretty much ever since. And I guess, I've seen basically entire changes in how the industry has evolved. When I first came, it was it was pretty much a generic market, very high prices. You were getting products 4 to 5 years after launch in the US and Europe, virtually no intellectual property protection. We are now, I got to tell you, this is the golden age for the healthcare industry in China right now. Our IP is pretty much as protected as it's going to be anywhere. We're getting regulatory approvals within a year of a European or a US approval, Japanese approval. So the regulatory time frames have been streamlined significantly. In the reimbursement market, it used to be 20 years ago, very, very limited healthcare coverage, insurance coverage. Now virtually 98% of the country has some level of coverage. So honestly, I'm quite bullish about the China market. From our standpoint, the environment's never been better. And I guess the other thing that I just want to kind of point out, I know sometimes the press over here has probably been pretty, pointed out some of the issues, but honestly, the government, at least from my perspective, has been very, very supportive of our industry. And, honestly, it's been a pretty good experience.
Eric, would you, that's a pretty optimistic or sounds very good. I guess, Dan, before we move on, we'll ask Eric about other industries. What about drug prices? The Chinese government, I know, negotiates from a national point of view, something that maybe some of us in the US would find might be of interest here. But they negotiate the price. So are you being reimbursed fairly, you feel? Is it that?
Well, look, every company is going to have a different experience. But I think if a company decides, every negotiation is going to be individual. And if, they make the decision to go ahead, then obviously, they feel that, the volume that you're going to get with the price tends to work. So, that's very much a corporate decision. But so far, I think we've been okay with the experience. So.
Eric, do you want to comment about any other industries? What about consumer?
I agree with Dan. It's industry specific. And when you look at our membership, we have two types. One is what we call in China for China, right? Like Dan's company and others, they really look at China as their market to serve. Disney theme park is a good example, right? You have to be in Shanghai or in China to offer your Disney experience to the Chinese consumers. Consumers used to travel to Hong Kong or Tokyo for that experience, but having Disney theme park right there in China. And Disney, by the way, is the single largest foreign direct investment in China. So, and they're doing very well. We can talk about the COVID impact later, but generally speaking, it's a good success story. And another example is Apple, right? Apple, ubiquitous brand name in China, and Apple is selling so many Apple devices in China. And Nora mentioned my old role is AIG. And obviously AIG China is not a huge organization by AIG's global standards, but it's very important to have that license in China to provide insurance coverage for AIG's global clients who are operating in China, like General Motors and so forth. If you don't have the license in China, you will not be able to serve those clients of yours, your global clients. That's why if you follow Mr. Hank Greenberg recently, he actually came out with, together with a few other China experts, to say it is actually in the national interest of the US to have a more commercial relationship with China. So that's one side of the story. Obviously, we also have another type of members who are in the supply chain manufacturing business. So if you focused on labor-intensive products, for instance, low value-added products, so probably China is probably not an ideal place for you now. Maybe it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, but even 10 years ago, companies, multinationals were already moving out of China to other, less expensive places because the labor costs in China have been going up. And obviously, most recently, trade wars with additional tariffs from the US side. So that was certainly a huge challenge for exporters. And also, latest one was the pandemic, the impact of the lockdowns and so forth, the disrupted global supply chains. So those are having a huge effect on some of our members. So when you look at the multinational companies in China, there are different types, and there are opportunities and challenges depending on your own industry.
And a quick word on services. Can you make a broad comment on service industry?
So it's interesting that you mentioned that. So for retailers, particularly high-end retailers focusing on luxury goods, for instance, since COVID, last year, Chinese consumers were not able to travel overseas to buy luxury goods from other countries, like from the US and some European countries. But the business were doing very well in China because consumers in China went to the local shopping malls. I'll give you an example. One of our C100 members, his name is Ronnie Cheng, right? He's got Plaza 66 in Shanghai. And last year, just the tax revenues alone exceeded 1 billion RMB in the Plaza 66. If you're familiar with Shanghai, it's on Nanjing West Road, just one building, tax revenue alone, 1 billion RMB.
Yeah, and I noticed an article today that they're expecting Hainan to be the world's biggest duty-free market very soon. I've actually read that the Chinese government officials have been going out of their way to help foreign companies in the last couple of years, particularly during this COVID period, making sure that their problems were solved quickly. And I don't know if they were worried about them leaving and losing the employment base. I'm not exactly sure what the reasons for. Have either of your members experienced that, or Dan, have you experienced that? Where actually the local governments are reaching out to make sure that you do stay and you're successful?
Yeah, I mean, particularly with the COVID example, I mean, this was kind of an extraordinary period anyway, at least for Shanghai. I mean, having been through it, I can say I wouldn't want to do it again. That said, I mean, we were pretty much at home for about 2.5 to 3 months, depending on where you lived and your own personal circumstances. My own personal experience, I have to tell you, wasn't all that bad. We were able to get lots of supplies, and it was a very difficult time, however, for patients because you couldn't get to the hospitals to get your medications and to see the doctor. So it was very challenging. A couple of side notes on that, and I'll get to specifically answer your question. But what's interesting is the technology that's evolved in China has really kind of helped mitigate and find solutions to some of those problems. So, people could do a an online consultation. They could do delivery of their products, their medications, that sort of thing. But where we started to have potential issues, for instance, when you import medicines into the country, you have to go through batch inspections at customs. And, you know, the customs officials were as locked down as anybody else. So, you know, it's very difficult. They had to have passes to be able to get to the labs and be operational. So they were not by any means at full staff. But, you know, the government was, I have to tell you, the Shanghai government was eager to step out and try to help and solve where they could. You know, I'm sure there were a lot of issues that frankly were a little bit beyond their control, but, you know, by and large, we were able to keep, you know, stable supply of medications, which was our biggest concern. You know, and eventually once we got to the point where we could get back into the office, you know, you probably heard about the frequent testing that would be done. We actually were able to arrange with the Shanghai government to actually have basically a testing site on our property so that our employees could actually more conveniently be able to do this. So yeah, I mean, you know, what's the motivation behind that? I mean, certainly we are taxpayers in their region and they want to support that, obviously. But I think also, you know, they're very committed to trying to mitigate the difficulty that was having across society and on the people. So, you know, not an ideal situation, but fortunately things are getting back to normal. Eric, I don't know if you have additional perspective, but.
Sure, I agree. Just based on our survey, again, I'm going back to our CBR survey just last year. You know, when you look at the government transparency, policy transparency indicator, there was, you know, the trend was improving over the past few years. And I'll cite two other maybe data points. One is certainly market access, you know, using financial service industry as an example. Obviously, under WTO, there was a requirement for, you know, joint venture up to 50% joint ventures with foreign companies, say in life insurance business or in securities. And they did away with that a few years back. And so now actually you can have up to 100% or wholly owned subsidiary in China owning a life insurance company or a securities company. So that's certainly one major improvement. And also I think when you look at these regional trade agreements that China has been able to sign, using one, the RCEP, right, which is the regional 10+5. 10 is ASEAN countries plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And that's a pretty significant agreement. And they're going to talk about, you know, zero tariffs for many industries, sectors. It was a major step from China's standpoint in terms of its commitment to opening up its market. And China also applied to join the CPTPP. If you follow the history of TPP, it's the latest version of TPP that the United States originally proposed. And China actually is trying to join that, led by Japan. So we'll see whether China will be able to join that. And obviously, a few years back, China also signed a free investment treaty with EU. Obviously, it's been put on hold right now because of other geopolitical issues. But from those regional agreements with other countries, you can see China is trying to be more integrated with the rest of the world, and which I think is a very positive sign.
I think we can't ignore the kind of elephant in the room, and that's Nancy Pelosi's gone to Taiwan. Geopolitical, or at least U.S.-China relations from a political view are poor and fading fast, I guess is the way to put it. There's talk in Washington of potentially restricting outbound investment. And of course, we're coming up to midterms. And then we're going to have the presidential election in 2024. So I suspect the talk about China is going to get more heated, and it's going to get maybe more difficult for for U.S. companies operating in China. So let me turn to Bob and say, Bob, have you seen a situation like this before? I think 1989 might be an example where the business community basically is saying things are okay or that we want to expand, and the political class is saying, nope, we got a problem here. So how would you look at from a historical point of view, and what do you think of today's situation?
You know, Nor, after 1989, a lot of American businesses did not think things were fine.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, the membership in the U.S.-China Business Council in the years just before I joined the organization went through the floor because it seemed in the 2 years after the tragedy in Beijing, it seemed that the Chinese authorities had re-embarked on sort of Maoist policies politically that were going to make it impossible for foreign companies to realize their ambitions. And it was only when Deng Xiaoping went on his famous trip to the South and reopened the floodgates, you might say, of reform within China that American business optimism returned. And thankfully for me, arriving in the spring of 1994, returned with a vengeance. The U.S.-China Business Council that I was lucky enough to join grew by leaps and bounds from the mid-90s on. But in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, a lot of American businesses just didn't see that they were going to be able to function very well. I think one of the things that's hard to answer, but that needs to be looked at in all of this this difficulty with engaging with China is there are a couple of things to think about. One, I perhaps am naive, but I optimistically believe that China's given course on any given day is not set in stone and likely to proceed in a linear manner. That just has not been China's pattern. And we've seen over and over again, not only since 1949, but even earlier, we've seen very significant, even stark changes of direction in China. I don't write that out for the future. Xi Jinping thinks otherwise, obviously, and thinks that he's got a winning combination right now that will lead China indefinitely into a brighter and brighter future. I certainly don't wish China anything less than a bright future, but I'm not sure anybody should bet on today's realities as the pattern that is going to go on forever. The related to that is the question of whether we've seen cyclical things happen before. You know, you asked, nor have we seen anything like today, like the circumstances of the Pelosi visit in the past. And we come down to questions of when the two sides are annoyed with each other, as they clearly are now, there's a difference between things that can't be walked back and things that can be walked back. China has, for its part, put all sorts of countries in the doghouse for periods of time. Think Norway, think Holland, and others. You go into the doghouse and trade is interrupted, and after a certain number of years, suddenly things kind of fade away, and more positive normality returns to the bilateral relationship between China and these countries. Some of that will be the case with the US, but the question is, what is it that either China or the US is doing now which really cannot be walked back? And we're at the edge, I think, in both countries, and China is very much a party to this. We're at the edge, or maybe have already crossed the edge, of taking steps that it will not be possible simply to kind of turn the spigot off on and return to a more normal future. And certainly if the United States were to proceed for the first time with a serious government effort to intervene in the evaluation of outbound US investment, going not only to China, but anywhere else in the world, but obviously with China in mind, that would be one of those steps that would be very hard in the short to medium term anyway, but very hard to turn away from and could leave lasting damage. But there are plenty of others, some of which have already been taken by the US or by China, I might say. I need to stop, but I want to emphasize how much our friends in China have not been doing the US any favors as the US toughens its approach and ratchets up its own rhetoric. It's a very difficult and unfortunate situation in both directions.
Yeah, and now we're faced with, well, let me start again. We had Kevin Rudd here, the former Prime Minister of Australia, this week, and he gave a series of talks about Xi Jinping's China. And he spent a lot of time one-on-one with Xi Jinping in Mandarin, talking about issues. And he's convinced that Xi is a staunch Marxist-Leninist with a relatively low opinion of business. So what happens if Xi Jinping does get his third term? Is he going to crack down? Now, this may not be just foreign business, but is he going to crack down more in business and make it more statist? And if that's the case, how do foreign companies react to that? I don't know if Bob wants to start on that one.
I don't mind picking up on that for a minute. I think one of the things which is reversible, or at least modifiable as time passes, is some of the hard-nosed so-called Leninist approach to the operations of foreign capitalist companies in China. That, to me, is something which can rise and fall. It may vary by province or even by city, as the examples of Shanghai that Eric and Daniel have suggested indicate. I don't think we're bound to see a sort of a Soviet-style 1929 Stalinist Xi Jinping suddenly pull the plug on all those foreigners. The emphasis on hostile foreign forces has been there a long time in the party rhetoric, and that to me again is one of those things that I think is modifiable. I would not be surprised if once the Congress is out of the way, even if the leader is reinforced in his apparently permanent hold on the top job, we began to see some modification of this constant bombardment of rhetoric about hostile foreign forces, which can spill over into the way in which the bureaucracy is told to look at foreign businesses. So I'm not too worried about Kevin Rudd's assertion that Xi Jinping is a Leninist and a Stalinist. He may well be, but he's got a country to run and an economy to support, and the presence of major international companies in that economy is not going to go away, including, I might say, American companies. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some modification of rhetoric, at least, with regard to American companies once the Congress is out of the way. We'll have to see.
Eric or Dan, any comment on that situation?
Yeah, maybe I can make a few comments, and then Eric, maybe you want to jump in. But honestly, I think from the last 10 years that we've seen for business, it's been for foreign companies, it's been pretty good in China. And if I look at the policy direction that's been established and agreed upon, Healthy China 2030, some of these things, I'm not overly concerned about that. I mean, this is a Chinese political question, but from a business perspective, they need the economy to continue to do well.
Right.
And I think, President Xi is also concerned about the economy. The last couple of months with COVID, I don't think should be taken as the litmus test. I think that should be the exception. But, clearly the economy and economic development is going to continue to be a priority. Every meeting I've had with government officials at senior levels, the message is always the same. Our door is open and it's only going to get wider. So, China is open for business. I don't think, who leads the country over the next 5 or 10 years is going to make a difference on that. That's just my view.
If I could just add to that, when you look at, the program, the entire program under President Xi, oftentimes they mention this catchphrase or slogan is the Chinese people's wishes for a better life should be our government's ultimate goal. If that's the case, then I think foreign companies in China, like our members, AmCham members, have a lot to contribute to that goal, because we provide excellent products and services to improve people's lives in China. So from that standpoint, it is win-win for both sides. And also, we watch the the globalization of China's continued globalization effort, that's not changing. As I alluded to earlier, China, have reached quite a few regional trade agreements with Southeast Asian countries, with Asian countries, Pacific countries like RCEP, is trying to join the CPTPP and so forth. And so from that standpoint, you can see China wanted to be, at least continue to be more integrated with the rest of the world. And as Dan just mentioned, from an FDI standpoint, they continue to at least encourage foreign direct investment in China. After the latest round of COVID, I think they're going to actually even do more to attract foreign direct investment into China, including American investment.
Yeah, I actually saw the FDI numbers, I guess, for the first 6 months of the year in China, and they're pretty robust. Obviously, last year was because of COVID; they weren't great, but they've bounced back pretty well. So,
I was at a meeting in Montana about a month ago, which was also attended by a lot of people, both from the high-tech sectors of American engagement with China, but also with people with very strong and distinguished military backgrounds. And I was reminded of something that I began to figure out for myself in my last years at the China Business Council, 2001, 2, 3, 4, and that is that at the end of the day, in the United States at least, and I'm sure the case could be made in China, national security will always trump business.
Yes.
And so as we speak with veterans and current participants in the vibrant Chinese business environment for American companies like Dan and Eric on the ground in China, it's very important to have their views and their experiences shared more widely, particularly in the United States. But it's also worth reminding people who are on the ground doing the business work in China that there is a dialogue in the United States about China and national security, which is not cyclical. It's not that we're going through a phase compared to that we saw 8 or 10 years ago or 15 or 20 years ago, because China has changed so much in the meantime that the national security dialogue is just not the same discussion now. There were people 20 years ago who might have been crying wolf, but really now the whole structure of sort of intellectual and professional opportunities relating to China has shifted heavily in the United States in the direction of opportunities to take part in the effort to confront and deal with China as a national security challenge to the United States. So I guess my point here is not to throw cold water on the positive experiences that our people on the ground in China, like Dan and Eric, are having. It's important to get that message back here through door knocks or any other means we can. But it's also important for American companies on the ground in China to recognize that the national security dialogue in the United States is very tough now. And the few people who are out there in the think tank world, like Michael Sween at the Quincy Institute, who is arguing that we're careening off unnecessarily in a national security dialogue that we really are going to live to regret careening off into, they are not being listened to very much. I guess I have no conclusion to that other than to say, on the ground in Shanghai, AmCham and AmCham in China and Beijing and Wuhan and everywhere else needs to keep its members clear as to what people are saying in the security dialogue back here.
Thanks, Bob.
What do you think, Norm?
Yeah, sorry, who would like to respond to that? Okay, thanks, Bob. So that's a question I've had. And we're getting a lot of questions coming in the chat box. And one is, are U.S. companies preparing contingency plans if geopolitical issues get really heated? And again, from a supply chain point of view, I know some are looking to move out of China. So what's the outlook, Eric? Are companies talking about this, or at least planning for issues?
Yeah, I could start, and Dan probably could add to that. From a supply chain strategy standpoint, obviously, even quite a few years ago, companies were already reallocating or readjusting their global supply chains by moving certain supply chains out of China, right? Because of the cost issues. It was more of a business consideration. And then came the trade war between the US and China. Actually, the tariffs have not been reduced since then. So companies certainly made plans to try to, move some supply chains out of China. But then came this year, obviously, the disruptions are very, very significant. So now companies have a decision to make. In the past, because China was such a strong competitor vis-a-vis everybody else in terms of its manufacturing capabilities and its infrastructure, skilled labor force, and you name it, the entire ecosystem. And there was just no competition. And for companies, if you only focused on just-in-time, focusing on efficiency, China was an easy decision. And now, because of the disruptions and geopolitics and so forth, companies have to find a balance between efficiency and resilience, right? So they may have to pay some higher costs in order to prepare for a different scenario. So they're moving away from this just-in-time to what we call just-in-case scenario. So China plus one, China plus two. China will continue to be a primary source of products, but just in case, companies may need to have a plan B, even a plan C. So that's probably being discussed in boardrooms right now.
Nor maybe just from my own experience, maybe I can just add a couple of points. I mean, at least large companies in particular, I think, most have a pretty deliberate process around risk assessment. We certainly do, and that goes all the way up. It's chaired by one of our board members. And at least at the China level, we look across our entire business as to what are the key risks that we need to mitigate against. And I guess, at least speaking from my own experience, I think the bigger challenge is how do we make sure that we don't accidentally get crossed up in broader political issues and, companies becoming kind of the target. And I've seen many examples in my career, and I don't need to get into them, where that has happened. And I think, from my standpoint, we're very bullish about the China market. It is one of our most strategic markets globally. That said, everything that Bob just talked about, I totally agree with. And companies have to be sensitive to this, and we certainly are. But we work to figure out what is the risk and what is it that we can actually do to control that and mitigate at least the impact to us. And that's kind of where we're focusing. But as we started out the conversation today, every industry sector is going to be quite different. What is the role that China plays in your global strategy? For us, we do production in China, but it's mainly for China. So we're not concerned about necessarily breakdown in the supply chain could impact other markets, because that's not really the risk. The risk to us is how do we make sure that, a breakdown in the supply chain doesn't prevent us from being able to extend important medications to Chinese patients. And how do we make sure that, things like what happened overnight don't necessarily get us caught in the middle. And we have nothing to do with that, unfortunately, but but it's rather sensitive, from my view, and I don't know whether people would agree with me, but Eric and I have shared this numerous times. I'm quite concerned, not only about the Sino-US relationship, but also the Sino-European relationship. It's worse than I've ever seen it. And unfortunately, I don't think it necessarily needs to be as bad as it is, but I don't think either side has a lot of people that are willing to step forward and, kind of speak to the middle right now. And I think it's going to remain that way for some time. So I do think that, it's important that, the business community at least be able to share what is our real experience on the ground, so that people realize, what, hey, wow, that's a different side of it that I didn't expect. And I can tell you, I saw one of your the comments in the chat box. Is there a feeling of anti-American sentiment? I have felt nothing but warmth from the Chinese people. I mean, honestly, I've had a tremendously good experience throughout my career, and even recently with everything going on, government officials are still very welcoming. They're, so it's, I think there's somehow we got to serve to ratchet down some of the tension to get us back to a more normal framework, if there is a normal framework.
So the message you're giving, and we've had sessions like this ever since COVID started, basically virtual sessions. The message has been very consistent, basically, from AmCham Shanghai and other foreign business operators in China. That exactly as you said, Dan, that business continues pretty well and opportunity is still there, and the government is fairly receptive to, which is probably not what most people would expect reading the media here in the U.S. So as Dan said, there are a lot of good questions coming in. Part of the title of this was post-COVID business environment. So can I specifically ask, is there anything that's going to change doing business in China that is a direct result of COVID, presuming that things will get back to normal in let's say 12, 18 months, 24 months? That anything there that either of you say?
I'm the least qualified to speak to that, so I'll start. One of the things that appears to those of us who are living outside of China and understanding what's going on there, mostly by reading or by watching, one of the things that seems to be happening is that because of COVID, foreigners, for example, in education, teachers in international schools, or mid-level expats in foreign companies, not necessarily the most senior figures, but people lower down, people younger, people with kids, have tried to get themselves out of China. And I wonder whether there will be a complete, if and when COVID ever is normalized to the point where it doesn't have a daily impact on people's professional and personal lives, I wonder whether those Americans and other foreigners will return in the numbers that they have been until COVID came along. I suspect that's going to be a legacy issue, both for companies in terms of staffing at sub-CEO levels in China, but also for foreign and American families, for example, who want to raise their kids or educate their kids there, which becomes an expat package problem, which becomes a corporate management problem as well. I don't know whether those of you who are in Shanghai have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. The current COVID measures, right, having these very tight controls and hotel quarantine now down to 7+3, used to be 14+3, still very, very difficult for travelers, right? Imagine you are a US CEO from New York. You're not going to spend 7 days in the hotel, then +3 more days in a home just to visit your troops there. And it's also very difficult for our CEOs based in China to go to their headquarters in the US or even attend regional meetings in Singapore or Hong Kong. It's just very difficult. So I think the current measures have to be revised. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for multinational companies to operate in China. The second issue, obviously, is flights. Right now, there are very limited seats available, very expensive. So those things have to be resolved before China could talk about, full resumption of operations. When you look at Shanghai, the first half, right, the GDP growth was negative, almost 5.7% negative. This is the first time Shanghai has seen a negative number like that. And Shanghai was one of the two provinces and municipalities in China that had a negative GDP growth number in the first half. The other one was Jilin, which, in the northeast. But even Jiangsu and Zhejiang had very, low growth rates, 1 to 2%, and China had 2.5 for the first half. So that's why they gave up the target of 5.5 for the whole year, because it's nearly impossible to hit. So I think right now a key critical path is this, whether China will be able to revise its travel policies vis-a-vis, relative to COVID measures. Otherwise, it'll be very challenging for China economically.
I don't know that I have much to add. I think Eric and Bob have summed it up very well. We've got to get a restoration of flights. We're starting to see it happen. They've got to get rid of the quarantine pieces as quickly as they can, because there has legitimately been an exodus of the foreign community in China. I have to tell you that. And Bob summed it up pretty well. The kind of the below CEO level, there's been a significant exodus. And I think when that happens, the big difference I see between now and say 20 years ago is, everybody wanted to come to China. And when they came to China, it created an experience that lasted with them, and it created a perspective. But now when that exchange isn't happening, it's easy for misunderstanding between the sides to occur.
I think
people aren't having face-to-face conversations.
This is what Dan has said is really important. But I think that there is out of that the possibility of a change in a more positive direction. I think underlying the whole U.S.-China relationship from 1972 to the present, from Nixon to the present, has been the question of opportunity. Where in the golden decade of the 80s, which was the decade in which I really threw myself into this, I and so many other people did so because China represented a vast range of opportunities, whether it was to make money or to realize your innermost dreams or to find a life partner or to actually try to live out some of the things, your values, in ways that meant something to you, whether it was in business or any of a whole other range of opportunity sectors. And that's malleable. That for the time being, things are quite glum on that score, particularly because of COVID and the regulations, for example, in travel, which are enough to chop up anybody's opportunities and flush them down the toilet. But that kind of thing is changeable. And I sit on the board of a little foundation that gives grants every year for advanced Asian language studies, Chinese, Japanese, other languages. We have a cooperative agreement with a program at Tsinghua University in Beijing. And in the last year or two, the applications from wonderful students all over the country, not all of them in school, people with life commitments in China, young people who have worked in China for years and want to improve their language, mostly to go to Taiwan for advanced language training rather than the mainland, because the situation on the mainland in terms of regulations and so forth, leaving aside US-China tensions, is so difficult. But that's changeable. Those kinds of things, again, to come back to things like 14 days versus 7 days, changing the availability of flights, some of those kinds of things can move in a positive direction and would restore some of that sense of opportunity that Americans need to have if they're going to really be involved on a personal level in China.
So Bob, let me follow up with Dan and Eric on an issue. So if what's happened is, as you mentioned, a lot of American families are leaving, teachers are leaving, which means you'll increase the localization of your staff of foreign companies. So is that going to create more of a distance between head office and the China operation? Again, when I was the head of Cargill in China, a big part of my job was in calculating the local employees with the company culture. And you need the head office, somebody from that office to do that. The more and more people, expats don't want to live in China, you're going to have maybe a bifurcation here of how the head office thinks and how China thinks. So that's one issue. And then TT raised the question of cybersecurity and even talking about companies. Is there going to be worries about exchanging information because people, maybe head office doesn't want to share things with China or vice versa? So Eric, Dan, you want to start on those issues? And Bob, you're welcome, of course, to chime in.
Eric, you want to go first, or do you want me to?
You go first.
All right. Let me try to answer this simply. We have a lot of people that want to come to China right now, so that's not the issue. It's getting them here and getting their families here. You know, one of the strangest things that I think Eric and I have both seen, it used to be that the international schools wouldn't recruit from each other, and because they're having challenges keeping teachers, that's one area that's broken down. So I think once the things begin to normalize, I think the desire for people to have an assignment in China is going to come back. So I'm not so worried about that. But I do think there needs to be a concerted decision at the government level that it's time to make that happen. And whatever the triggers are that they have to have in place to feel comfortable to do that, I'm quite optimistic that those discussions are underway. They're not public discussions for sure, but I think, you know, ultimately we're going to see this thing rebound in the next 6 to 8 months, I would hope. On the cybersecurity thing, yeah, that is a concern. What's concerning about it is that it's a little bit nebulous as to what some of these regulations mean, and it's how they're going to be interpreted. So we are, you know, certainly spending a lot of time trying to understand this, but we're also having to, you know, to the question about, and I thought I saw a question in the chat box about decoupling. It's not necessarily decoupling, but it's sometimes having to create a IT system unique to China to fit the infrastructural needs of China. It can be quite complicated, but it also creates opportunities for us to experiment with things that maybe we wouldn't do on a global basis because frankly, it's too big, but we can actually pilot some of this stuff. There's some really cool stuff going on in China. So cybersecurity, yeah, it's a challenge, but maybe also a bit of an opportunity. So
I just can add a quick comment on local talent versus expatriates. Localization of talent in China has been going on for quite a while now because of the more availability of qualified local talent at a senior level. And when you look at US companies operating in China, at least among our members, probably half of our companies are now run by local talent. And now, obviously, we still need expatriates who are better connected, who understand, better connected to their headquarters, who understand their culture, the corporate culture better, and who are more able to communicate with the headquarters. So we still need those people in China for the long term, because currently that's probably one area that local talent is not quite there yet in terms of communicating with the headquarters because the cultural differences and so forth. So, but it's already happening. And I think there will be more companies going forward to be run, I'm talking about at the CEO level, to be run by local talent. But it's always good to have expatriates connected with our markets in China.
Eric, does AmCham do any work on helping PRC citizen executives of U.S. companies to deal with this endless problem? It's been since the beginning of different perspectives between the field operation and the headquarters. Is that an AmCham project at all?
That's certainly something that we'd like to do more in terms of providing real underground information to headquarters of our member companies, because sometimes we are in a more objective position, right, to talk to the headquarters. So sometimes our members are interested in bringing us into the conversations, in a board meeting situation. We'd like to do more of these. I think it is going to be more and more important, because in the past 3 years, our headquarters, CEOs haven't been able to travel to China.
Indeed.
And if they just read, press in the US, they'll get a distorted view. I'm not saying wrong view, but a kind of a distorted perspective of what's going on in China. So hopefully AmCham can play a role in that, in terms of, communicating with the headquarters on what's truly going on the ground.
Great. And with that, we've come up to time. That was, I think, a very good closing comment, Eric. And I think the general impression in the United States, or at least from the media, is that things are not good in China. Probably American companies are under threat, et cetera. And I think today's session certainly hopefully dispelled that thinking, though I think, and we're probably preaching the converted on most people participating on this session. But it's been very educational for me. I thank the participants for their views and for being very open with us. Again, I'd like to thank AmCham Shanghai, the Committee of 100, and of course my organization, the Washington State China Relations Council, for putting this together. We look forward to do it again in the future. And again, it's very interesting times between our two countries. So I think we should do this frequently to keep in touch and make sure that that we all understand.
Great to see you, Eric and Dan, after 20 years or close to 20
Likewise,
years.
Bob.
I know,
Great.
I know.
Wonderful.
Great to see you.
Great. Thanks to all participants, and we'll sign off now. Again, thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.